Hi, I'm Steven Soderbergh. I'm here with Mike Nichols. We're going to try and talk our way through Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. There's a lot to talk about. Firstly, this is the initial foray for you into feature filmmaking.
Yep.
Let me ask a big question. Given all the elements involved here, you're working with Jack Warner, you're working with a well-established writer-producer, you're working with the biggest movie stars in the world. What did you think was going to happen when it became clear you were going to direct this? How did you think it was going to go?
Well, it was my idea that I should do it because I was so, I don't know what the word is, I was so struck by the play. It seemed to me, in some weird way, Elaine May and I had just been out of town in a play she wrote for me to be in, and it was a disaster, and we closed in Philadelphia. As soon as because I'd seen all be short plays. As soon as I got to New York, I went to see Virginia Woolf, and it knocked me out. I thought, boy, his pen was just in flames. You could tell, and he didn't stop. I mean, it was like some burst of inspiration, and in that sort of loony way that sometimes happens, as you know, I just thought I knew all about it. And I happened to be friends with Elizabeth because the year before, I had been planning to get married, and we were going to go to Rome, where Richard and Elizabeth were shooting Cleopatra. We'd become friends when Burton was doing Camelot, and Elaine and I were doing our show, and we were in the same alley, and we'd go out every night. And he and I became very good friends. And so I was meant to get married there, and then I broke the engagement. And while I was breaking the engagement, he was starting with Elizabeth. And I said, look, we're not coming, there's no wedding. He said, why don't you come anyway? So I did, and I was there for a few weeks while they were shooting Cleopatra, and he said, please take care of Elizabeth, take her out, at Rome and everything. And she said, well, I can't go out, I'll be recognized and we'll be stampeded. I said, put a thing on your head, a kerchief, and I'll drive you, somewhere, and we'll be cool. Which is what happened. We went to Villa d'Este, walked around all these fountains all day. And at one point, somebody said, there's Mike Nichols. That's the only thing that happened to us. But over the time, we got to be pretty good friends. And we had the same publicity guy back in the States. And at one point, I said to him, you might mention to Elizabeth that if she's looking for a director, it should be me, because I understand this piece. And that's how it happened. So that, a very long answer to your question, I sort of thought, I know what to do with this. And now I just hope I don't mess up with the camera.
Right. And how did you begin to educate yourself about the camera? I know you and I have talked at length about A Place in the Sun, which is one of our favorite films. But how did you start that process of educating yourself?
I just watched and watched and watched movies.
Did you watch them with somebody?
I watched them every possible way. I watched them alone. I watched them with who was going to be the DP until a certain point, and then I'll tell you about that. And I did that cruel thing to California DPs. I made him watch 8.5 and
right.
And a lot of Rotuno's work and stuff from Europe. And then, to make a very long story short, there was the time when Jack Warner said the picture has to be in color. And I said, well, it can't. Elizabeth is 32 and won't carry her makeup, and the sets are all built. And he said, well, it has to be. And I said, well, then you have to do it without me. And we ended up in black and white. And the DP that I had hired, who was a great DP, came a couple of weeks later, and he said, hey, Mike, I figured out how to get that look you like so much, that like 8.5. He said, the thing is to shoot it in color and print it in black and white. And I said, oh, I'm so sorry you said that. I got to fire you. Then I had to find Haskell. And
What did you seen of his? Had you seen America, America, or?
I'd certainly seen America, America. And we both in a sense come from Chicago. I knew his whole family, and one of his brothers was a very close friend of mine, and I'd known about his work, and I'd known the Wexlers all the time I was in Chicago at college. And I think that I sort of did my investigating on the most childish level, away from DPs. For instance, I was friends with Tony Perkins, and we were about to start shooting. I said, there's nobody else I can ask this, but this is how naive I was. I said, I know I want to start this shot with them coming through the door, coming at the camera, and I know I want to be very close to Elizabeth when she comes in, and then to Richard. I said, but won't the door hit the camera? This is the level of my sophistication. And then he reminded me about lenses, and I said, oh, yeah, right, of course.
Right. Oh, God.
And what I remember about doing this scene, in fact, when they came in the door, Haskell said, I'd like to just pull them into the kitchen and then pan and see her go to the refrigerator. And Haskell said, well, if I get in the living room and if I track as they're coming down the hall, they'll appear and disappear. And I said, well, what would that do? And he said, well, it would be interesting. And I said, but what about the scene is made clearer by that? And he said, well, nothing, it's just interesting. And I realized that I was going to have to make all those choices myself because there's no other way I could tell the story. It's where I first understood that really only the director knows what should be happening physically in every shot. And that can't come, it can come from somebody who's worked with you for years and who knows how you make your points. So that was it was interesting and in some way scary and heartening at the same time because I thought, well, okay, it's up to me. And I'm such a smartass, I think I know what to do. Why don't I see if I'm right or wrong?
Now, as part of the support team initially, you had working on the film this gentleman, Doane Harrison,
right,
who had worked for Wilder. And he was sort of how do you describe what he did? He just sort of helped them lay shots out, right?
No, he was there for me. Billy Wilder lent him to me. He said, I want you to borrow Doane Harrison. He's such a good plotter of the cut. In other words, to shoot so that if you know how you're going to cut it before you set it up, is the most useful thing. And that made perfect sense. And he was a very nice man, Doane Harrison, and he would say, I think you should do this shot and then cover it from here and from here. And I would say, okay, that makes sense. And then just sort of shoot it and not realize that I wasn't doing what he had said because I was constantly being pulled by the event of the scene.
Right.
And I couldn't keep in my still shrunken head anything but what I knew what was happening in the scene. And he was very nice, but he left very quickly, like in a week or less, because he thought I was just ignoring what he said, and I was not. I was trying to use what he said, but I had
sort of ingesting it and making it yours.
Right.
Yeah.
And I had these other obligations, I thought, to the scene and
right.
to the events of the scene. So then he was gone, and I needed to look. No, we had together, Doane Harrison and I had together chosen an editor to what Doane Harrison called to handle the film.
Mm-hmm.
And we hired Sam Osteen together. And it was my first film, and it was his first film. He'd been an assistant editor for 8 years, which was the union requirement. And we just immediately hit it off
right.
and started working Saturdays and cutting stuff together.
Well, there's an account of one of your initial meetings, or maybe your initial meeting, where you asked Osteen, can I shoot overlapping dialogue? Can I have people talking on top of each other, and can this still be cut together? And he said, absolutely. And apparently nobody ever said yes to that question before, to you. Absolutely,
you're absolutely right. They all said, don't overlap, you mustn't overlap. And I said, well, you can't do this piece without overlapping. There was Osteen who said that, having, I suppose, done it, cut overlaps
right.
for whoever he worked for. I mean, the various guys he worked for. But you're right, he was the first. And he turned out to be, as you know, a great editor.
Yeah. Now, you rehearsed for 3 weeks
Yes.
beforehand.
Yes.
Tell me where you'd seen the play, and I know that you would have seen Arthur Hill and Uta Hagen.
Yes, exactly, right.
And did you find that their performances were still with you? Did you find there were things that which is a tricky thing to do if you've seen something you like and now you're dealing with a new set of performers and you want to hang on to an idea that you've seen before, and that's a tricky proposition if your actor finds out that it came from someone else.
Well, it is a tricky proposition, but what helped me was that I found something really interesting that I've experienced since when I've done other things that had been plays and became movies, primarily Angels in America. And I had never noticed this before, but it's a sort of crucial principle. A very good play is usually very funny, too. Even Hamlet is very funny. There's very few plays except O'Neill, and even in O'Neill there's big laughs. But a play like Virginia Woolf, there's a laugh pretty much every 20 seconds. And it's part of the pleasure of seeing it, and it's part of the problem of seeing it on the stage, because it's broken up into little pieces. And what I discovered in working on Virginia Woolf is that you don't have to stop or slow down for laughs in a movie, so that you could have what actors sometimes call arcs. CAA uses the expression more than anybody now, but it's the thing that keeps going till it stops.
Right.
And what helped me out of having seen the play was that I knew some of the rhythms. I knew a lot of the places that you had to keep going and not stop yet. And that was extremely useful because, as you know, the problem of making a movie is that you tend to stay away from complicated rhythms and speeds and everything because it locks you in so completely. But in this, it seemed to me we had to commit because it was so seated in the words.
Right.
And that's where, having seen the play, where I have to forever thank, the director and the actors who did the play, and they were great. Uta Hagen was great. Arthur Hill was great. Schneider was great. They did a great production. And the fact that I could say to Elizabeth, no, don't, no, you can't cry yet. You have to keep going. You have to keep growing. Now you cry.
Right.
Sometimes I knew it, and sometimes the play helped me, and that was a blessing.
What was there? You were dealing with 4 actors who, are all very unique. What was rehearsal like? How did you learn? I mean, you dealt with actors a lot prior to this, but this was a sort of new circumstance, and one in which, at least initially, I would imagine you don't walk in with the kind of power that you did when you walked in to rehearse a Broadway show.
Well, yes and no, because I had...
You know them personally.
Right. I knew them. Siegel and I had done a play or two together. So there was that. There was the fact that Richard and I were such good friends, and then following that, Elizabeth and I were good friends. But most of all was the fact of the 3 weeks of rehearsal, because it gave them a chance to figure out the obvious things and for me to help, but also for me to understand what the keys to them were. Elizabeth is very, very physical. What helps her is to know where she'll be, what she'll be wearing, and so forth, the physical aspects of it, the business.
Right.
And I'm good at business. It's what I used to do for Neil Simon, is just keep them going and going with plenty of business. And Richard is about the sound. And he was a pleasure for me because he would say, how should I say it? Say it for me. And I loved that, and he loved that. And it was hilarious for me to, the way I sound, to tell him how to say it, and for him then to do his Richard. But But because he's such a lover of poetry and was such a great reader of poetry, tell him how to say it, and he's happy because you've given him a thought,
Right.
really. And so it went with all of them. We found each other through rehearsals. And there's something about this play. And there's a story about God Damn You, by the way.
Yeah, she says, screw you. You had to loop it.
I had to loop it. They wouldn't let us say screw you. And of course, originally it had been fuck you, and they took it out of the play for screw you. And then they wouldn't let us say screw you in 1967 or 6. Yeah.
This was the first film to carry the label that no one under a certain age could be admitted without a parent or guardian.
Right.
It's the first film to carry that from the. Well, it was an interesting time. You're in a transition here. Hollywood's been working with this production code for many, many years. And then this is the beginning of what we would later know as the MPAA,
right,
that Jack Valenti started to address these issues. What was Jack Warner's feeling about the language and how far you could push this? What did he say to you, or how did he express? Was he worried?
He didn't say much to me about the language. He sent Louis Nizer, and there was great fear of the Catholic Legion of Decency. That was very important, and I had a plan for that. Well, I don't think I can tell what we did, but what happened really was that I got some very impressive, sort of morally impressive people to come to the same screening as the Monsignor, and they did really like it a lot, and they said, you know, what a moral film it was, and the point was that we got past the Monsignor, that the Catholic Legion of Decency approved it, and that made Jack happy. That
right,
was the main thing he wanted, and then I don't think anybody ever really thought it was all that shocking.
Right.
It's hard to do that.
Now, it's funny, normally I might say 3 weeks of rehearsal is a lot, but with the complexity of this piece, was it enough? I mean, when I look at this and I see that the staging is so elaborate and the scenes go on for so long, and like you said, you've got to keep building and sort of coming up with this press and release in terms of the emotion. Did you just start at the beginning and literally figure out, okay, you're going to be in this room, you're going to come here, you're eventually going to land in that chair, then you're going to cross, and...
There are a lot of things that I figured out before we ever started, just in terms of the physical staging. For instance, the gun, the whole thing of the gun, I figured out I explored all the places I wanted them to get out of the living room and all the places I didn't. I did all that before. Most of my work, in fact, before was just sort of dreaming and envisioning the things where I wanted to take it out of the house, namely, you know, the car that comes up later and the leaving the house and all the things that transpire. That I did in my head when I was working on it, and with the exception of the one thing that didn't work, which was the monologue, which was Martha's monologue by herself in front of the tree, we had it. It just wasn't something film wanted.
Right.
Having figured it out, we did that thing of, and again, it was the beginning of something that I still do and love, which is to rehearse, if possible, as far from when you shoot it as you can, and never completely nobody wants to perfect the scene. You don't want to get there. You want to feel it out and know what's there and name the things in the scene. This is what's happening here and this is what's happening there. And then in forgetting it, I always find when you come back to it months later because of your shooting schedule, that it has ripened in some way, ripened and simplified. And that happened for us. And then also, of course, we would stop and work on the scene before we shot it with each scene.
I wonder if you could show me where the...
Are you all right?
Oh, of course, dear. I just want to put some powder on my nose.
Martha, would you show where we keep the euphemism?
What? Oh, I'm sorry. Come on, I want to show you the house, Ed. We'll be back, dear.
Now, you were, we usually are, shooting out of sequence.
Right. Well, as much as possible in sequence. We did unusually.
But in this case, you went away first to do all of the location material, and there's some very precise. I would imagine we'll talk about some of these transitions. Some very precise emotional chords that have to be sustained from you leaving the stage and moving on to location.
Right.
Where literally somebody's in the middle of an emotion as I would imagine, they're leaving a stage shot and you're cutting outside and the scene is continuing.
Right.
That's got to be hard.
Well, it was hard, but
if you haven't rehearsed and don't know
we
chords.
couldn't have done it without rehearsing. Absolutely could not. But then also, one of the things I think that animated this movie most was that here were, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4 stage people. Richard, George, Sandy, and me. And starting with Richard, who was the most awed by it, but we were all awed by Elizabeth's knowledge of film acting. Because it wasn't something you thought of. You just thought she was the world's most beautiful girl. But you didn't realize how much she knew. And they watched her very closely and actually learned from her and talked about it. And of course, the main thing that Richard learned, and he talked about it, was to do as little as possible. I have hundreds of thousands of feet of Richard listening in scenes, and he does absolutely nothing but listen. And I think that they're actually learning from Elizabeth. Of course, she wouldn't talk about it and couldn't talk about it, but she is one of those very few actors who have that deal with Technicolor that on the floor over and over, I'd say after take 18, I guess that's it, there's not going to be any more. I'd say, okay, that's great, thanks, Elizabeth. And see it the next day, and it was like 50% better. There was all these things that you couldn't see standing 6 feet away, but they were there.
Right.
And then when I was editing and scoring, I realized she even left some room for the score. She counted on all that in some semi-conscious way, so that they were watching her, they were learning and loving working with her because of the great surprise of her being able to handle all this verbal material.
So she understood. She just understood it.
She
had an understanding of film acting, which is a very specific thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yet it sounds totally intuitive, and that if you sat her down and grilled her about it, she, as you said, she probably either wouldn't want to talk about it or might not even know how.
I think that's right. I just think also that she, I mean, I don't know, I should be telling it in context, but that her essential nature informed so much of it, that there was she was very worried about the scene about the little bugger, about the crying and her telling about what the baby was like. She was so afraid she wouldn't cry. And I said, please don't worry about it, It's going to be good no matter what happens. Which indeed it was, and we were shooting it, and she was really crying, and she was wonderful. And right in the middle of the scene, from the catwalk way upstairs, she heard, and was so loud that I had to say cut, and she said, please don't fire him. That's the first thing she came out of the shot with, and that's what she's like.
Yes, I know. Yes, well, if you were married to Martha, you would know what it means. Then if I were married to your wife, I would know what that means too, wouldn't I? Yes. Martha says you're in the math department or something.
No, I'm not.
Oh, Martha's seldom mistaken. Maybe you should be in the math department or something.
I'm a biologist. I'm in the biology.
Talk about when you're trying to, there's some very interesting editorial choices being made throughout the film. For instance, a little while back when they're coming downstairs from being upstairs, there's a really great little overlap with the ice going into the glass, which on the film after this, in The Graduate, you were exploring this sort of overlapping and pre-lapping things, post-lapping things in a much more elaborate way. But you see there's a lot of things in here that are not common for studio movies, certainly at this time. How much of that? I know from reading a little bit that Osteen was around and you were talking to each other a lot. Did he come down occasionally while you were shooting? And would you say, "Look, I'm thinking of this. Is it going to work?"
Yes, he was around a lot. He ended up always on the set with me. It didn't happen yet on Virginia Woolf. And it's interesting because John Bloom, my editor now, neither wants to be on the set nor know a thing about what we're doing. He wants to be surprised by the film. And it was exactly the opposite, and each worked. Osteen and I would talk certainly about the sound and about the overlapping and so forth. And most of all, we worked every weekend. We stayed caught up. I was so nervous about the possibility of missing stuff and wanting shots that I didn't have, which, as you know, is the only real regret as you're shooting. You never can cover enough, and you always think you've covered too much, and you always wish you had something that you don't. So Osteen and I would run into the little cutting room on the Warner lot and put all this stuff together as soon as we could, and sometimes indeed find something I wanted, or he might say, "We could this or that," and I would go get it because we're still in the house.
Right.
That was one of the luxuries, that we were in this house for what seemed like a lifetime.
Right. What? Now I want to talk about George Segal, who I've always loved. In relation to his character in the play, it's part of the dynamic of the play, or one of the ideas that's in it that's interesting to me, is this notion of being a witness to something that you shouldn't witness, and the reason that you can't escape it is because you are not in the power position. They've come to this house. They've been invited by the daughter of the president of the university, whose husband also works at the university, has been there quite some time, and they're not in a position really to set any terms.
None.
Tonight.
And most of all, they can't escape.
Right. And it's that dynamic that I find fascinating about the play. I'm sure you related to that situation, or you connected with it in some way. And George Segal, or his character, I would imagine this was a tricky casting decision for the film, not only for you, but for an actor. It's not a. You have to undergo a lot of humiliation, basically.
Yes.
You have to be willing to lay yourself out there and be pretty significantly humiliated for a long time. And there's some actors that don't want to do that.
Well, that's very
don't wanna play it.
astute of you, because, well, Redford was one actor who didn't want to play it, because he was, I had worked with him on the stage, and he was a friend, and he just plain turned it down because for the very reason you just said.
The weakness.
Yes. And having to undergo all that and demonstrate the weakness and the sort of ass-kissing part of that character. So George, I knew, both from working with him and knowing him and seeing his work, that one of his essential jokes that would keep coming back was being humiliated, was screwing up in various ways, that he's very funny with that and rather enjoys that joke.
Right.
So that it seemed to me that he was close enough to the young god that he needed to be for Elizabeth, and witty enough, most of all, and funny enough to deal with all that humiliation.
Talk a little about Sandy Dennis, who's also amazing, and I want to ask if the shot of her standing at the top of the stairs, which is really great, was that planned? It looks, when I watch it, I look at it and go, wow, my first instinct is you had rolled, she was waiting for her cue, literally waiting for her cue, and you just used that piece of film before the scene started, although I also could see how you would plan it, that she is waiting for her cue in the larger sense of the film,
Right.
to come downstairs.
No, I did plan it because I wanted to begin to crack her confidence and for her to understand, to know that while she was out of the room, she was being betrayed. That because she discovers in the end the giant betrayal.
Right.
And this, for me, was sort of the beginning of, oh, he's not observing the glass bell that's supposed to fall over a couple and nobody's supposed to know anything.
Right.
He betrays her all the time.
Well, it stands out because I think at this point, especially in American films made with studios, there's the tendency is to cut to whoever's talking.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that I love more than anything, almost anything, watching somebody listen.
Yes.
And I know a lot of the films that you and I admire, especially Bergman films, have these extended shots in which you're staying on someone as they maybe speak occasionally, but they're listening. And it just tilts the entire scene in a different direction. And the intention, it's a directorial choice that indicates an intention that you can't really write.
I think it's very true, but also, as I began to learn about movies, it seemed to me that the most important decision for me in things like Virginia Woolf and things that either were originally plays, period, or things that were in the imagination of the writer, were based on words, were based on the theater, whether they had been plays or not. And whatever kind of movie I then discovered, even if it's a movie with hardly any words, that the big question, to whom is this moment happening, is one of the most crucial questions. My biggest question is, what is this really like when this happens? What is it really like? Never mind the conventions. And I love asking that question of the scenes and of the actors and of myself. But then my private decision is, whose moment is this? Whose experience is it? Like right now, what we're looking at on the screen is, of course, Richard's response is everything. You can't do the scene without Richard. And one thing is to keep cutting to him, but it's also very nice to establish that he's back there pretending not to listen.
And also in this scene, when she sat down, and in that reverse that we just saw of Sandy Dennis, it's that shot of her. There's a big close-up, long lens. First time in the movie we've seen a shot like that. And I find that those are also really crucial decisions, when to get close, when to get really close, because you got to dole that stuff out. It's an easy crutch, I think. And this is a scene that's interesting because again, you're keeping her dialogue. It doesn't make literal sense. Her dialogue stays in your ear. It stays very close.
Right.
While we follow him. The reason it makes perfect sense to me as I watch it is, well, if he's heard it so many times,
exactly,
of course it can be close. It should be close to his ear.
And it's entirely being done to him. It doesn't exist for any other reason. And I just thought this is one of the places where the movie has an advantage over the stage, in that it's his experience, period. And all this is his experience too, even though he isn't in the room.
Right.
And through this, the essential contradiction of the two couples, it exists in all these scenes, which is that Nick and Honey appear to be close, a young, happy young couple, and George and Martha appear to be enemies, but
right.
Of course it's the other way around.
Right.
And the slow discovery of that is an important skein in the plot.
Now, in the stay, I've never seen this on stage. does he merely just leaves and comes back
Right.
with the rifle, and that's
It.
Well, that's for those who are interested, this sequence is a perfect example of something that cinema does that you really can't do in any other medium. Because
think that's
as you can
right.
imagine the difference between being on stage and having him leave and come back and what we just saw. Again, in terms, if the goal is to put you inside someone's experience, I can imagine it must have been exciting for you to watch this happening, making this movie and seeing all the possibilities, the things that you can do to abstract or expand and get you deeper into a character or a situation. It must have been really fun.
It was a lot of fun. I was very excited. I was very happy throughout this whole process. And part of preparing for it, I remember, was William Wyler was a big hero of mine, and to see something like, for instance, The Heiress, which is like a perfect play. It's a perfect plot and a perfect play. Doesn't seem to need anything else. Somebody like Wyler comes along, and he does the scene where Clift teaches de Havilland to dance. She starts out incredibly clumsy, and he's funny and patient and doesn't embarrass her. And she loves it, and she becomes quite good in a very, very short time of fooling around at a dance. And that's a typical Wyler contribution, that he does something you couldn't do in the play, and he sort of gives you a glimpse of what their sex life would have been if they could have been together. Never mind he wanted the money, she would have been happy. And he was a very great film director for that reason, that he could fill in the things that you couldn't see on the stage, and that's what you sort of aim at, that what can we do that couldn't be done when everybody was locked in one room with the audience?
Now, talk a little bit about what shape was the screenplay in when you got on board? I would assume Lehman had taken a run at it, and you came. What was it?
He'd made a lot of changes. The essential change that he made was that he decided that because there had been some criticism of the end of the play, The Imaginary Child, that he would make the child real. And he wrote that, the way he wrote it, that they had had a child who hanged himself in the hall closet on his 18th birthday, and that they had sealed up the closet and papered over it. That was their secret. And I sort of, at first gently and then quickly, not very, explained that wasn't going to be possible, that it's completely immaterial whether it was criticized or not, but the fact of the imaginary child, and that it was their secret, and that they're at such an extreme.
Well, that's a heart transplant.
That's a heart
of an
transplant.
Idea,
right? Well, because he didn't.
Mostly because, to me, they don't behave like people who have children, actual children.
That's right.
They just don't. I mean, to me.
No, what you see when you find out about the imaginary child is how much they love each other. That the central metaphor, you know, Erich Fromm defined love, real love, as wanting the loved one to be his or her best self. That's why she tortures him. That's what they want for each other. They actually love each other very much. And people, when I used to say that, people thought I was nuts. But of course it's true. It's the very essence. It's why it's worth doing. And in the same way, the central metaphor of an imaginary child that only they know about, you understand a lot about it when you think of love and the possibilities of love and the impossibilities of it. And the fact that during the course of these 2 hours that he is betraying it, that he's betraying the fact of their imaginary child, that he's talking to other people about it, and she says, how could you? And he says, well, but you started, you broke the rule.
Right.
You mentioned him first, which he said gave him the freedom to do it. You can't take all that out and just say it was a real kid who killed himself. What I did basically was to return to the Albee text and to cut it. I had in the course of it, I had to cut my favorite line. Abstruse in the sense of recondite. Don't you tell me words. That it just didn't fit. We couldn't do that part of it. But the fact of returning and needing to cut some of it allowed me to use the time exploring it in my head,
Right.
and finding the various, like I said, the sort of breaks in it and the physical events.
Right. What, I know I read this, tell me if this is true or not, there, I guess you were having discussion about whether or not Richard Burton should wear glasses. And this is something, Lehman felt that perhaps he shouldn't wear glasses, you felt that he should. And he says, well, what if we get really close to doing this and we still disagree and you want him to wear glasses and I don't? And you said, well, I'll kill you. Which
It's true.
Well, it's funny, and also, aside from the joke, there's a point at which, you know, you have to be that guy. I mean, you've got to be the person with the last word on these issues. Were you able? Did that happen before you were shooting? Were you able to sort of plant your feet and establish yourself and set up the dynamic in which, you know, everybody feels this is your movie?
Absolutely. I found that easy and almost fun. The problem is that I was put, you know, it was my first movie. Lehman was Warner's choice. He put us together, and he was that most peculiar of all things. He was a producer-writer.
Although he does, as we know, he has one spectacular script to his credit.
Yes, he does, Sweet Smell of Success, and it was excellent. And he was indeed...
And North by Northwest.
That's true,
Yeah.
which he did together with Hitchcock. He was very talented, and he did good work with those guys. But I don't think was really suited to the Albee stuff. And I wasn't... it's funny, I've gotten a little more patient since I started.
Right.
But when I was doing this, I didn't have the patience. And he was also not a man used to, for instance, being a producer and thinking of the actors first when we got to the location. He had a huge sort of dressing room, and George Segal had none, you know. So I would get pissed off at things like that and probably be rougher than I needed to be. But the first thing I learned, it's strange. Somebody said the other day that somebody's advice, Nora asked somebody advice, Nora Ephron, on her first movie of maybe Rob Reiner, whoever I can't remember which mentor she asked, do you have any advice? And whoever it was said, fire somebody on the first day. And by happenstance, there was a first assistant on Virginia Woolf that was on, of course, early as they are. And at one point I said to Elizabeth before we started shooting, I said, what do you think of him? She said, well, he's very unpleasant about you. And I thought that's strange, because to me he was very unpleasant about Elizabeth, so I was quite worried about him. And on the first shot, on the first day, when I said, okay, we've got it, he walked off the set, going right past me by about 3 inches, and as he passed, he said, oh, well, it's just another picture. And I said, you're fired. And it was nice. I sort of was glad that he had done that and made it so simple. And I didn't know that it was a good thing for the first time. And Maida Rebner, who's a whole other story, the script supervisor, was a real Blanche Dubois lady that I was very fond of. She said to me when we were on location, she said, Mike, the crew's very upset with you because you kept changing the setup last night. And I said, what do you mean? I didn't even know what it meant. And she said, well, you kept moving the camera without shooting and then moving it again. And they were really angry. And I said, really, I'm so sorry to hear that. And then, of course, that night, I just changed the setup. I never took a shot because I thought, I really did feel like the Merchant Marine, like the rest of the guys. I had to prove that I was going to be strong. And it all sort of worked. And to my surprise now, looking back, I never worried about it. I had no problem about it. I was a prick some of the time. But that was fine because I felt so sure that I knew what to do. I don't know how I got so confident. I never was. Again, I got less and less and less confident as I went on. I started out very confident. I couldn't tell you why. But I think it was this connection to the material.
I'm really very sorry. She really shouldn't drink. She's frail. Slim-hipped, as you'd have it.
Well, now we've made one of our transitions now out of the house, and there's a real. You've given, one of the things I like about the film is as I was saying, this sort of press and release. We have a moment after, a peak there, and Honey gets sick. They come outside. There's a long, quiet spot, but of course we're getting ready to build again. But it's important. I think the high points are not high if you haven't had these little valleys to sort of regroup. Have your Gatorade and get ready to run again.
Absolutely.
But Burton, this is a great scene for Burton. How do you? We've got a great monologue coming up, which you did in basically one shot.
Mm-hmm.
How do you judge a monologue when you've got something that that can't be cut later? You've got to sort of take it all in one bite. What is how do you judge that?
Well,
or in this case, how did you judge this? It's a crucial moment in the film. I think he delivers it masterfully. It's a great performance.
It is the great speech in this play, and it's the very essence of Albee. And every word is where it belongs. It's a beautiful speech. I got to do it myself. Elaine May and I did Virginia Woolf much later at Long Wharf Theater. I loved getting to do the Bergen speech because it is very great language. It's wonderful to do. It takes such good care of you. We had a little extra thing on the Bergen speech, which is that Richard was not so great at remembering long things at this point. And he was terrified, and I didn't let on, but I was terrified that he could never get through it, and I knew it should be in one. Yes, I was going to cut to Nick, but I wanted to decide that depending on what was happening. And Richard stumbled around, and he did a few takes, and then the thing happened that you all pray for, and he did this perfect, beautiful, very moving version. He just did it perfectly. We were thrilled, and I said, that's it, and kissed him, and God bless you, and all that. Well, the next day, it turned out that Haskell had miscalculated the exposure. It was off by not a point or two, but like 8 stops. And it looked like high noon. And I said, Haskell, I'm sorry to tell you, he's not going to ever do it again as well as that. I know him. And you've got to just dupe it and dupe it and dupe it. You've got to do whatever you need to do, which he did. And you're looking at it. It's not bad.
Oh, really?
But it looks like a very nice day for night. But it was extreme day for day. And that's one of the things I learned is that now, of course, it's literally true that you can do anything once you have film. But even then, if you said, this is it, sorry, there was recourse.
Right. And what was... as I said, so you shot, you went out and got the location stuff first.
Mm-hmm.
And things were, I know the movie in general went over schedule, where when you were on location, were you gradually, were things taking longer and the schedule was expanding even when you started and you were on location?
Well, the very fact that we were on location was a symptom of how green I was and how little I knew, and also how bossy. Because if everybody hadn't been scared to tell me, it was perfectly clear that this could all have been shot on the backlot without any compromise whatsoever. There was no artistic superiority in going to Smith College. But I didn't know that. I thought it had to be in a real place. Mostly for the walking around and the roadhouse and things like that. So and then it would rain, of course. The Bergen speech could have been done on any stage in the world, and a lot of these scenes could have. But I was dumb, and I didn't know that yet, and I mistrusted all the Hollywood stuff. I wanted to be sure it was real. So I think that was the main reason that we would go over, was the rain.
Each of us with a grown-up's hangover. But it was the grandest day.
But this ended up being, from what I've read, literally one of the most expensive black and white movies made up to that point.
Yeah. And I think it was how much time we took. I think it was that Silbert, I played right into Silbert, the art director's, hands, because he was great with reality and detail, and he built all this stuff, as you say, solid. And he would build whole rooms in case I wanted them when I had not planned any scene in them.
Right.
That plus the location and the rain, and I think it has to be put down to my inexperience. To some extent, Richard, who couldn't work every day, but it was, I'd love to know how much over we really were. It was like something like 3 weeks, I think.
Yeah. But in retrospect, it sounds to me there were so many lessons learned that, in essence, if that's a mistake, then it's a mistake you have to make.
I guess, because it
to
turned
get to the
out,
other side.
I think the parking lot, which is still coming up, and which was the scene I feared most. And interestingly, I was talking to my DP on the next movie, like yesterday when we were in Africa. And I told him that I was so curious about the camera by this point that when we did the parking lot scene, for Elizabeth's long lens close-up, I had two cameras as close to each other as possible with minimally different lenses. And one of them was deadly dull and the other one was very exciting. And there was surely no more than 3 feet between the two lenses. So that was a huge lesson that I learned on this, that strange differences in detail make big differences.
Oh, yeah. I've had that. I've had the experience. There's an operator that I work with as often as I can. His name's Gary J. And I remember on Traffic watching how a small adjustment could absolutely transform a shot. We're talking inches in some cases.
Yes.
Down, across, a foreground, something in the foreground happening differently, and suddenly the shot's alive.
Yes.
It's that's exciting and scary at the same time, because you realize your mind immediately goes to, well, how many times have I not made that last adjustment?
Exactly. It could have been there, but wasn't.
Yes. So, for instance, this scene, the scene of them out by the swings, which, again, is a long scene. There's a lot of coverage that has to be taken care of. How long were you guys out here? A week?
I suppose it was a week. Because of this, I remember the swinging, and Sam Osteen went crazy on the swinging because, of course, it was exactly out of sync from shot to shot,
Right.
and that thing that happens. I wouldn't be surprised if it wasn't a shooting week. that we were there. But then, of course, you know, that it's really. Well, I'm trying to remember what state it was. Where is Smith College? Connecticut?
I think so.
Yeah. It's real Connecticut country, and there are real crickets, and it's really cold at night, and all the little things make a difference. I mean, you can't go there for them,
Right.
but once you're there, they're a bonus.
This is slightly off point. I like shooting at night, strangely. Mostly because you feel like the people, nobody shows up to visit at 3 a.m, and so I feel like the people who are here are the people who really want to be here, and I don't know. I love shooting nights.
I agree with you. It isolates you in a very good way, and I think, you know, I mean, I have this tricky theory that I talk about, and I probably shouldn't, which is that the whole thing is it's a process of tapping your unconscious and the actor's unconscious and ultimately the audience's unconscious. And there is no way to just say, okay, let's just work with our unconscious here. But there are ways to encourage it to take over a little bit. And night certainly is a time-honored way.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
There was more to it than that.
Sure. I bet she has money, too.
Yes.
Yes? Yes? You mean I was right? I hit it?
Well, you see,
My God, what archery. First try, too. How about that?
You see,
There were other things
yes.
to compensate.
Yes.
There always are. There always are.
An actor that I know was telling me the story about working with a Russian actor who was a very, very sort of dark personality, and a friend of my actor friend had said, well, was there anything that made him laugh? Did you ever see him laugh? You know, what would get him to sort of break that and smile or laugh? And my friend said cruelty. And I'm reminded of that story because this material is both funny and cruel. Why can cruelty be funny? And where's the line? When is it not funny?
Well, it's interesting to consider where's the line. Have you seen Lieutenant of Inishmore?
No, the new play.
Yeah, it makes you ask that question because no one has ever taken physical violence as far as this on the stage, where limbs are cut off and heads are chopped off and thrown around and so forth, and people have blood spurted all over them until they're completely red, and the audience is shrieking with laughter because the very talented author has kept everybody safe. This is the extent, he's Irish, and this is the extent of his rage against the IRA. This is how furious he is at what's been done to his country. And the audience immediately understands that this is vicious, vicious satire and parody. And you couldn't go any further. Maybe it has to do with that, with the fact of if there's some ideology connected with it, then there's no end to how far you can go.
Right.
And without an ideology, you shrink very fast. But what's interesting about the cruelty in this is that it's the weakling who's constantly laying the trap. George is subjugated by Martha, we think. He's the patsy of all her jokes. The guests laugh at him, encouraged by Martha. He's laying a trap all the time. It's a brilliant plot because he mines Nick for material and then destroys him and Honey with Nick's own confessions, with his disloyalty, with the fact that they're not really a couple. I think it's pleasurable partly because it is revenge. It's the revenge of the guy who never made it, nobody ever kissed his ass. They're kissing Martha's ass, and he has to live with that. And it's turning the tables and realizing in the end, he's the strong one and Martha's the weak one. And Nick and Honey are constructs. They don't love each other. They don't know who they are. They're a pure facade. So that to that degree, it becomes a metaphor for God knows what. Once people are called George and Martha, you can make it the whole country if that's what you're in the mood for.
Right. No, it really, in watching it again to prepare for this, I was much more aware of the structure of it, of the structure of all of the arcs, and that it is about betrayal and disloyalty, but it's also about, well, for him, it's about provocation and survival, and also at a certain point you begin to feel. You asked the question, I think, as you're watching the movie initially, or as you're experiencing the material initially, why are they together? Why do they stay together? How could anybody stay together and behave like this? Part of that answer, I think, has to be, well, I look at it and I go, well, who else can they love?
Exactly.
Except each other.
It has to do with that. And I think that was what was so brilliant of Albee, is to choose this what they call in Europe, this milieu, this locale. Because of Academe having all these special characteristics. You know the old joke about Academe. Why is there so much backbiting and viciousness and betrayal? The answer is because the stakes are so low. And I think that's almost true. That mediocre academia, it's one thing when it's a great writer who's working at a university. It's a whole other thing when it's somebody who doesn't write at all, but is just in the role of an academic. And it's a great place for these things to happen. Among other things, they have nowhere else to go. George and Martha, I think, literally have nowhere else to go. And then you finally realize, and people always argue with me about this, but I firmly believe it, that how much they love each other and how much they are each other's lives. And in the end, it's not even such a bad life. It's that...
Except for the liver damage.
Liver damage is serious, especially if you count the drinks in the movie.
Oh my God, it's terrifying. I was actually, when I was watching the movie to get ready again, I started it pretty late, and I realized when I finished it that I'd finished watching the movie at the time that the movie starts.
Mm-hmm.
It was like 2-something in the morning, and I just finished watching the movie, and I thought, oh, this is when they're coming. They're just coming over now.
Exactly.
And they've been drinking all night, and they're going to continue to drink. It's no wonder it turns into a car crash.
Right. People are in extremis.
Now, let's talk about the Roadhouse. It's one of those situations that I think are inevitable when you're making a movie. I think you can, on the one hand, I think it reads as what it is, which is opening the play up a bit, or an attempt to open the play up. And on the other hand, it's absolutely necessary. That on the one hand, you know it's a device and a conceit, but on the other hand, it has to be done. I mean, you have to get out of that house.
I think you really do. And when people say, but it spoils the claustrophobia of staying in the house, in the theater, claustrophobia is one thing. You're in a room that really holds 1,000 people. It's a very large room. There are intermissions. You can go to the bathroom anytime. Nobody's cooped up at all. But to subject people to the rhythmic similarity and the visual similarity of just staying in one room, it's not necessary.
Well, and there's also, I think, that psychologically, you go to the theater, there's an understanding the parameters of seeing something on stage. I mean, it's you don't have the option to leave unless, you know, we've all seen some pretty elaborate shows that do a pretty good job of transporting you. But that's different than an audience that sits down to watch a movie and they know sort of subconsciously, well, you can go anywhere in a movie.
Well, exactly.
And so why are you trapping me?
I think about this all the time because there's nothing as depressing as when in a bad play or a bad production, when the last actor has come on, because there's nothing left to hope for. You've now seen everybody that you're going to offer you. And if somebody isn't funny or sexy or something, and the play is bad, you're trapped. In a movie, as you say, and suddenly there could be a belly dancer, or you could be in Scotland, or
you can cut to anything.
Anything.
Yeah.
And I think it's a mistake not to take advantage of that. And express also the things that are being expressed, as long as you have access to some of the same words, thoughts, ideas, it can be expressed better in a movie.
Who was responsible for Sandy Dennis's interpretive dance here, which is pretty great?
I think she made it up.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
She made this up entirely on her own. She was a brilliant, brilliant girl, and also very interesting as far as the crew is concerned.
No, not with him around, that's for sure. Not with Twinkle Toes here either.
I'll dance with anyone. I'll dance by myself.
Honey, you get sick again.
I dance like the wind.
When the scene was over, she would go into her trailer because that's how she worked. She needed the time by herself. But she was adored by the crew. And Elizabeth also has this, I think is one of the very few people I've ever known that doesn't say people's names in different tones. She doesn't grade people. There aren't important and less important and unimportant. They're just people. And that, for a huge movie star that is so in the middle of the group like this, makes an enormous difference. That the people you're going to see in this scene are her hairdresser and her hairdresser's husband, who had some other function on the movie. That, in other words, they're the innkeepers here.
Oh, really? Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah, I used her people. And we loved them. And everybody, there was no way not to love Elizabeth simply because she was so simple with everybody. Now, this is one of the parts I'm deeply ashamed of because it was a moment in dance that they were carefully taught. And you look at it, and I just can't stand to see.
But I'll submit that if you went into a club right now and started the dance that George Siegel just did, that you would be famous. That's actually brilliant. But this, what about this choreography? Do you like this?
No, I don't like.
It's not based on your life?
It is not. It is not how I dance. We worked on this. We had Herbert Ross, a friend of mine who was a real choreographer, come, and they worked, and I taught them, and he and I decided what they would do, work for the scene. But I just think there's something about seeing dancing learned that has died long ago. That's awkward. It's like seeing pictures of the past, and they say, "Look at what I was wearing."
Now, a stylistic thing I want to talk about a little bit is the sort of strategic use of handheld in the movie. Mm-hmm. There's some really, when we're in the house, especially in sort of the first act, it's used as punctuation. The cuts, when you use it, tend to be fairly quick, and there's a real emphasis to it, and it really. It pops out, and in a good way. Where did that idea develop? Because it's a very pointed contrast to the more, not traditional is the wrong word, but you're working off a tripod or a dolly, or the idea of coming in and sort of isolating certain moments with a handheld camera. How did that develop?
It was partly the alcohol of it all. It was partly what you said, that, that if you're starting at 2 a.m. and you never stop drinking, you will be in and out. Things will happen, and then other things will happen, and you'll have dizzy spells,
Right.
and so forth. And so I wanted to...
That disorientation.
That exactly. And then the fact that there's suppressed violence and finally real violence and still everybody's getting more and more drunk. I just wanted to leave reality behind at certain points. I didn't even know that's what I wanted, but that it had to become not naturalistic. It had to become, well, like right here, this very, very forced shot, very
Right.
odd setup.
No, but there's a great, when the violence actually happens, there's a really terrific series of cuts. It's really beautifully laid out. And then that sort of ending with that sort of still frame of him just lying there, when things calm.
Mm-hmm.
What with Osteen was there? I know that. Here we go. These shots.
Yeah.
Now you're. Oh yeah, great cut. What about? I know that the sort of editorial god at Warner Brothers at this time was this guy Rudy Fair.
Right.
Would he watch? Who was watching your dailies?
They all were. We were nowhere near them. That is to say, obviously, we got phone calls from them when we were at Smith. And then we were on a Warner stage. And all the word that came from Warner and Rudy Fair and everything was complimentary. We got nothing but how well it's going and how they... And Jack would write and call and say he loves the setups, he loves the way the camera's being used. They were nothing but enthusiastic. Then what happened at the end of the film when I was locked off the lot, that's just a standard thing that he did.
Right.
That he would let you finish the cut and get it set up to mix and then throw you off because his mixing went faster with his own people. And that's where Osteen, proved he was the man he was, as well as in his brilliant editing. He would call me at night and play the mix for me.
Over the phone.
Over the phone, and I'd say, we got
You just play the whole reel.
Yeah.
It's kind of a great real world test, because if you could understand it over the phone, then
Then it had to be okay.
yeah.
But at a certain point, I said, I can't do it like this anymore. And I found Warner and I made a deal, and he stuck with the deal. He let me back on to mix it.
It's a tricky mix. I mean, it's a dialogue movie, but it's a really tricky mix. What was your relationship with the sound mixer? I mean, this was just, again, for a studio movie, this is just a very non-traditional sounding movie in terms of how people are talking and this issue of overlapping. And also, I know you like, from working on the stage, you like playing perspectives. When people leave a room, you like having it sound like they left the room.
Well, there's that. And also, Osteen and I had, for a long time, we changed phrases, words, syllables. Richard's Latin was all wrong, and I didn't want to bug him about it when we were doing it, so I had to find vowels in other words to correct his Latin. And Elizabeth's readings, I would slip a little phrase into a sentence or a paragraph. So we had all these little tiny cuts, and the mixers were excellent at Warner's, and you remember, you never experienced what you would have to do, of course. You did a reel, and you held your breath from the beginning of the reel to the end, because if somebody made a mistake 30 seconds before the end, you had to do the whole reel again. It's hard to believe that's what we did.
Yeah.
But awful as it was, just as it was awful not having any idea what the operator saw. You had to listen to him. And, of course, he couldn't report it accurately, and he didn't. He'd say, I lost her coming around the corner. No, actually, he lost her going into the corner,
Right.
and so forth. I would never want to do it again, but it made it very exciting. A reel was a very exciting thing. Your heart was pounding as you got towards the end because it was so good to that point.
No, I know that's my buddy Larry Blake, who does all my mixing for me, has been working on a book about this mixer Murray Spivak, who was a very well-known, well-regarded re-recording mixer, and on these huge, he did all the epic movies that were the really, really big ones. And I've read, text of Spivak describing the choreography of these reels, of these guys sitting down at the console and starting at the beginning and doing battle scenes, mixing them, and they would rehearse and rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. Then they would hit record and go. And it must have been kind of wild.
It was wild. It was exciting. It was one more performance thing.
Right.
And you had a great time.
Have you... What's the closest you've been to being in a situation like this, of being in proximity to emotional wreckage where you feel you shouldn't be there? I mean, is that...
It's very, very rare that I've seen it for real since my parents. My parents used to do this. I have no idea. It wasn't as searching or as vicious or anything.
Right.
They just used to fight, and I used to say, well, this is dumb. I'm going to the movies. I don't want to hear this. But there was a couple. He was English and she was American. He was quite a famous guy that all my friends and I knew in the, 60s. And they had horrifying fights in front of you, in front of everybody. And it finally made you just unable to see them because it was so disturbing. But the woman whom I always liked very much, who was a writer, at a party once that was playing some game, what's the thing you want most? And people would say things like a really good maid and so on. And we got to her, and she said, a happy childhood, and sort of stopped the game in its tracks. It was such an amazing thing to say. But I don't know that, have you ever heard people talk like this?
Not, as you say, not to this extent. I've certainly been present for, in situations where I felt I shouldn't be present. But I think it's, more often than not, though, I've certainly been in situations where you feel tension.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's, but it's less overt. I mean, part of the, I think part of the pleasure in watching a piece like Virginia Woolf is the sharpening of it, the polishing of it, the it's a diamond, that can only be when you have somebody like Edward Albee sort of machine tooling each word so that it's sonorous in a way that
That nobody could do in life.
Yeah, and yet it's still lifelike. It's not unreal or it doesn't feel like it's from another planet. It's just really beautifully tooled. I guess my tendency when I sense that sort of stuff in the air is to want to get out.
Yes, I think that's what happens. The party game aspect is interesting, that playing games deliberately. I have seen terrible things happen between
People
in a couple.
In that context.
Yes, and somebody recently told me, happily I wasn't there, about, again, a sort of party game in which you were supposed to say the thing you loved most about your mate. And it got to this one guy, and he said, she's very neat. And there was sort of a long pause, and his wife said, if you'll all excuse me. And she got up, and she got her coat, and she left the party, and she divorced him. This really happened. So that the whole idea of a game at a party is deliberately taking a risk, and sometimes people will take the bait.
Yeah, it's a very loaded situation.
Yeah.
Go on saying that as long as you want.
Do people still do that? Was that I'm trying to think of the last. I'm trying to think of when I've been at a party when there's been a game played.
We still play library.
Yeah.
Play harmless games like
Right.
that, but not these sort of interpersonal ones. No, I don't. I think there may be some people in New York who still do, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, I don't know them. We should talk about this scene. This is a tricky scene. Tricky scene emotionally. Again, you're out there on location. You're shooting in the middle of the night. I can tell that it looks pretty cool out. What? How were you feeling about this and her while you were doing this?
Well, here's the thing. I had been obsessed with this scene because there are certain scenes in this play and in many plays that draw on the possibility of the actors to have done what, in fact, Uta Hagen had done, be in classics and played, she did Faust when she was little. Uta Hagen was a great stage actress who played all the great parts. There's a big difference between that training, just in terms of breath control and all the things that go with long speeches that you just don't get making movies. You get, what do you do? If you have a 2-page speech in a movie, it's a big deal, right? So I was trying to find a place where the environment could give it some of what I could not ask or hope for from Elizabeth. And I think we got that, and then of course she astonished me completely, because there's no reason she should have been able to do this.
Right.
But she was.
I've gotten used to it. Once a month, and we get Misunderstood Martha, the good-hearted.
Did she?
Barnacles, the little miss that the touch of kindness.
How did the cast? Did they talk about the piece? I mean, thematically or sort of conceptually, or was there a sense of just focusing on the text and don't ruin it by describing it?
I think it was A, while we were rehearsing, and B, after that. In that, among other things, there were moments when Richard and Elizabeth caught it. It infected them, and they had some hard nights.
Oh,
and
yeah.
They were tough for us, too. Thank God, not many, but they existed. In this scene, the scene where they're coming out and they have a moment of wrestling by the car, she actually hit her head and started to pass out. And you can see her. I mean, if you don't know she hit her head, then you don't know it, but she did. And then, of course, we waited a long time and then picked it up there. But there were nights when Richard was very impatient with her. I say nights because so much of it is night. Even when we were on the stage by day, it was a night.
It felt like night.
Yeah. In fact, when you see the very last scene, they had mistimed the party. And the party was already going on behind the drop when they're singing Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf and everything. There's a party and people have to say, all right, hold it down, they're going to do another take. And the very end of the movie was done during the party on the stage. But that sort of Pirandello thing of it beginning to take over the actors, a certain amount of that happened to them. And so we were all we just spent our time being nice as much as we could.
Right.
This is where I got so mad at Haskell, where he said it was his idea. And I thought of it months before. And, of course, we had to rig it and wire it and fix it. No car will do that without the engine running.
Right.
But one nice thing about having a text that you're not going to screw around with is that you can keep doing it in your head and planning things.
Right. I've had both experiences of having a locked piece of material beforehand and having material that's in a constant state of flux, and I'm a big fan of having it beforehand.
Oh God, so am I.
It just makes everything easier. The no net quality of sort of creating on the fly is not one that I find pleasant. You learn a lot, but I think you're right. When you know something's going to be there when you show up, it affords you the opportunity to really let it percolate.
Exactly.
Now, it's just a quick technical question. For instance, how much of the house, how much of the facade of the house did you have on stage to allow for entrances and exits? Like when he's coming up to the porch there, did you have a portion of the porch on stage?
Yes, that was
Okay.
that was on the stage. And Silbert, even for the opening, he fixed up moths on threads.
I've always noticed that.
Yeah.
It's such a great.
It was a wonderful
touch.
idea. He was so great with detail. He thought of the moths. He thought of Mrs. Robinson's tan line, and she got the makeup for her tan line every day. That was something Richard observed and suggested. And now this is interesting about English actors. Richard and I were
Now it's a great backdrop. I mean, it really works well. This is stage.
This is stage. And he and I talked about it, and I suggested, I can't remember what it was. And he said, no. He said, Larry's done that. I said, excuse me? He said, well, Olivier did Crying That Way. He, being an English stage actor, knew or felt that he had to find a way to cry that the others hadn't done yet. And he did.
Wow.
It's an odd way to go about it, but I can understand it.
It's tricky. The laugh that turns into a cry. It's very, very tricky.
It is tricky.
I mean, I can do it, but only in life. So here we are back again. In terms of this, the difficulty of maintaining the sort of tonal consistency. So we've got Richard Burton completing a scene there that you finished up on stage. Now we're back out in location, picking up right at that moment. Or aren't we? Are we on location here?
I'm trying
Take
to
care
remember.
from the car. Do you think you actually had some of that on stage as
I
well?
think we did this on stage. I do. I don't think we were on location that long, and I think it would have been hard to ask this of all of them
there.
at the very, very top.
Right.
I'm pretty sure this was stage.
And I heard the sounds coming.
It was.
I didn't know what it was, and it frightened me.
Was that actually Elizabeth and George up there in the window?
I cannot tell. No, I'm sure not.
Yeah, stand-ins.
I didn't want someone there. I was
What,
What's going on, do you?
again, just a more conceptual question. How do you sort of measure, how do you sustain your enthusiasm and your energy over the course of a movie? Do you have any sense of how to pace yourself, both in a literal sense, in the physical sense, but also sort of emotionally and creatively? Because it's, it's making a movie is such a elongated process in comparison to a lot of other art forms. It can take a year. It can take years. Sometimes it's sort of like conducting a symphony in which you play one note a day.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it.
And I find that there is a sort of ebb and flow to my energy just by design, because you just can't come out of the gate at 90 miles an hour all the day, although I guess there's some people that do.
I think that this was different from all other movies for me because, of course, one, because it was the first, and two, because I knew so much what I wanted to do, which never happened again, ever. I mean, carnal knowledge, and to some extent closer, I knew what I was going to do, and they were similar texts. But it wasn't like this. This was different. But at the same time, I think even then, I came on the set the same way I do now, which is just eager to see what today's surprise would be, terrified that I wouldn't be able to make the scene work, usually I run into a thing I can't solve, and I think, oh man, this time I'm really screwed. This time I cannot get out of this corner. And then I think, well, but if I move this, maybe if I do that. And slowly, slowly you think your way or complain your way out of the corner. And one more time, you've been saved. That's how I experience most shooting days. Do you?
Yeah.
That you get out of the corner one more time. And you could be right, you could be wrong. Maybe you're not out of the corner, but you feel enough out to go on the next day. And I've become addicted to that to such an extent that I'm really sorry you can't do that in life.
Right.
I miss it.
Well, it's. I think a lot of that, in talking about whether or not you have a piece of material that's locked beforehand or not, I can imagine in this situation on this movie, the thing that was saving you was your connection to the material and the feeling that you know what it is, you know what it's about, and that as long as there's that Rosetta Stone to touch, all decisions will flow from your understanding of the piece. Whereas when you're making a movie in which things are the text is in flux, your connection by definition can only be fleeting. Your connection to the heart of the thing can only be fleeting because you're building on sand every day.
Exactly.
And the odds that you're going to hit that bullseye, to me that's like taking the dartboard and pushing it back 100 feet.
Which is indeed why movies are endlessly challenging and fascinating, because it is pretty much like that. I realized watching this, I remembered something that, of course, we were in a completely different situation from any movie that can ever be made now, or that, in fact, that I ever ran into after this, which is this. This was a hit before we ever started. Our very first day, the whole world press was there, and we spent it only talking to them and being photographed. Elizabeth was on the cover of Life as soon as we had her makeup and her hair figured out. Elizabeth and the Burtons and I were on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post.
While you were shooting?
While we were shooting. It was done before. An Elizabeth Taylor, Richard Burton movie, especially one from a very famous play, no problem. And that's why Warner...
Which presents its own problems.
That's right, exactly. And it's one of the reasons it had such a hermetic feeling to it that we had to try to... It was easy to forget it because, of course, scared is scared, and we would get scared. Would this be all right? But also because it's all out there. And Warner's was like this big fortress, and you were in it, and you were relatively safe until Warner threw you out.
She, I gather, Elizabeth Taylor was very happy, or at least not self-conscious about. She wanted to appear the way she needed to appear in the film. She didn't have any sort of self-consciousness about.
She has no vanity anyway. She said to me in this period when we were, I don't know, having dinner or something, just her and me, we were talking about her looks, and she said, you know something, I can't wait for it to go. It was enough already. And also, it was really funny. I forgot it, but sometimes it'll come back to me. The life they were living at the same time. I mean, first of all, we almost never got a shot before lunch. Elizabeth didn't have to show up till 10. Her makeup took till lunch. Then we would have lunch. Then we'd shoot in the afternoon, and then it was time for her to go home.
How did you ever get through this?
Well, slowly.
Oh my God! I would have gone nuts.
She was the only person I've ever heard of who had it in her contract that once a month she didn't have to come in for 2 days. She'd been treated so badly when she was a kid.
Right.
With all the stories of Louis B. Mayer, that she didn't like studios, and she put in all the stuff that she wanted to be sure of. But then they would have these big lunches. I feel like I'm making it up. One day they had the Duke and Duchess of Windsor for lunch. And, of course, they came back hours late, and then they started shooting. It wasn't all bad, but it was a bizarre contrast. Once Marlene Dietrich came on the set to visit Richard, and she never looked at or spoke to Elizabeth. She talked to Richard, she talked to me, she talked to George. And when she left, and she was there a long time, Elizabeth said sort of mildly, "It feels strange being ignored on your own set." But it didn't make her angry or worry her or anything. She was sort of nice about it. But we were that too. We were a place to visit.
Right.
Because they were such a big deal.
He is you know, is known for being many times nominated for Academy Awards and was never a winner. Certainly, this is one of the best. He had one of the best 1-2s from '65. Spy Who Came In from the Cold.
Yes.
And this movie, they've got to be two of the best non-awarded performances I've ever seen. Just
I agree.
Staggering.
I love Spy Who Came In from the Cold. I think it's a wonderful movie, and he was amazing. He should have won, God knows, for one of them.
At some point, yes.
Yeah.
Well, as we know, it's one of those awards that's often as defined by who hasn't won as by who has.
I think that's the thing about awards. You know, they're random.
But now she's 32, 33 at this point, Elizabeth Taylor.
Yeah, we were the same age, 32.
No. George. My husband?
You're kidding.
Am I?
You must be. Him? Sure.
You don't believe it?
Was it her idea? Did she say, "Look, I want to put on some weight"?
Yes, she said, "Oh, God," she said, "I don't have to diet. I'm so happy." That's how she came into this. And this was right after Cleopatra, so you see how much she gained for it.
Yeah.
Learning the games we play as quickly as...
And it really is true. I've seen color photographs of her in her makeup, and it really only works in black and white.
No, there's no question. It could never have been. I don't think the whole thing could have been in color, because the whole idea of, forgive me, but such words, of movie as metaphor changed with color. And since this play is such an absolute metaphor, I think it really is helped by a picture that is an idea of reality. It isn't reality. It helps because the whole thing is an idea of reality.
But this was really, I mean, at this point, black and white is really on the way out. This is the last year they awarded
Exactly.
a separate black and white cinematography Oscar. I'd be curious to know what other movies were made at Warner's that year and what others, if any, were in black and white, or whether or not, as far as the studios were concerned, you know, that's just, we're not doing that anymore.
Right. I think that it's funny when you think, I don't know what other movies...
Because I know by '71, when Last Picture Show came out, that was considered, even at that point, 5 years later, that was considered very, very unusual.
I'm thinking of In Cold Blood. I'm trying to remember. Well, that was just like a couple of years after us. But you're right about Last Picture Show. That was Bogdanovich insisting for one last time. And it was right again. It's always right. When is it a mistake?
I think, well, it's certainly, it's funny when you have conversations when you're going to make a movie, or when you want to make a movie in black and white. The financial impact, the fact that, you know, when you start talking to the studio and they say, look, all of our various deals change. We can't, in some cases, we can't have the deal that we have. We can't plug this movie into our deals because black and white is specifically excluded. When at the same time, when you watch commercials or videos or any non-movie related visual material, there's a lot of black and white going on. It's used pretty regularly, so certainly people are accustomed to it. But I guess in a movie, it's I don't know. It's become a big thing to ask an audience to accept.
They just don't
Certainly, it
seem
helps
to.
if you're in period. It seems more acceptable. But I have to admit, if you made a contemporary film right now in black and white, it would probably feel somewhat pretentious.
It would feel like that, and there's whole generations who just wouldn't want to see it.
Yeah.
But
Unless you're, there's always an exception, unless it's Eraserhead, which
yes,
was contemporary, was set in the present when it was made, and unthinkable in anything but black and white.
well, and they still do that. I mean, Sin City is.
Yeah.
I just saw it for the first time on the plane. Not all of it, but somebody was watching. And I started to watch. It's still a valuable tool. I think I miss it, as I miss a lot of the things from the past, because they were limits, they were restrictions, and we love restrictions. I hate to be able to do anything. Luckily, money is a terrifying restriction now, especially, and once again, you can hardly do anything, so you've got to be canny to get around that. I like that. I complain about it, but I like it because it's very hard to work without limits.
Well, I certainly think it's if you can create a circumstance in which you're forced to think laterally instead of vertically,
Yes.
there's interesting stuff around.
Absolutely.
But is it when at this point when you're making Virginia Woolf and finishing it, what at that point, what do you think your future is as a filmmaker? Did you feel like you'd totally caught this bug? You'd come up in another medium, but you've jumped in and happened to find the perfect thing to start with. How were you at this point? You were already the graduate. You were involved with.
You
were initially maybe going to do that first.
Yes,
yeah?
right.
Okay.
I got sent to Graduate and said I would do it. And then this came up, and I said to Larry Terman, a very nice guy who was the producer, I said, would you mind if I do this first? He said, no, of course not. And I was very glad. It worked out for me, technically. I was freer by the time I did The Graduate. I already knew.
I mean, did you have a sense that this was going to become, that this might become your primary mode of expression, or I don't know, how were you viewing yourself and what you were going to do?
I was sort of thinking that I loved both and that they were surprisingly different. They're absolutely different, really. They're not nearly as similar as one at first thinks, stage and movies. I also knew that I was in love and would do movies as long as I could, as long as they'd let me. But I was much nuttier. I was obsessive. I was a prick. I got totally crazy about something going wrong. I still remember the opening night of this, and it was an opening night because in those days the entire world press see it all at one screening. And it was a very big deal, and it was at Warner's. And when the second reel came on, it was about 12 to 16 points darker than this. The whole reel. And I thought I was going to have a heart attack. And I went running in the projection booth and this and that. It was just that dark. It was just one of those things. Well, and this is what I used to be like, and I suppose still a little bit, but not so much. I couldn't stop in my head bitching about it, so that the next day, when the guy in the LA Times said, God help me, he said, history was written in fire last night across the screen. I thought, yeah, but that reel, I couldn't let go of it. And I was like that for a long time. And I now think that it's a way to protect yourself from worrying about the real things.
Right.
That it's like your own worry bead.
Right.
So I was totally unaware of all the things going on and would it be a hit and what would happen. I don't remember any of that. I don't remember wanting to see the review. I don't remember anything except the second reel. So I guess I protected myself. but you get nicer as you understand that this group is everything, and you live or die through connection with them.
One more game.
What do you did Elizabeth Taylor ever perform on stage?
Yes, she did the Little Foxes.
Really?
She-
How old was she?
She must have been in her 40s. She did it, and Lillian Hellman was so happy it was being done that she, for once, stopped criticizing and bitching. And Elizabeth was wonderful with her, wonderful. And Maureen Stapleton played Birdie.
Oh, wow.
And it was a big deal, and she toured it. That one time she was on stage suited her very well.
And did you ever did she ever talk about it when you were I mean, is it something that she was conceptually interested in, or because she came, she started so young. She was in movies so young.
I don't think she would have wanted to do more stage. I think the whole discipline of the stage is so different, and she's on and off had trouble with her back, and that I think bothered her in the play. And no, I think she was happy to do it once, and also there's something about knowing that much about movie acting that it's a shame not to use it there.
Right. What? Here's an obvious question I should have asked earlier. Playing drunk. It's very, very difficult. And here you got 4 people playing drunk. How do you modulate that?
I think the rule basically is don't do it.
Right.
I mean, just ignore it, because it's so much. It's funny. I had a fight with an actress in a play in which everyone talked about her secret drinking, and she wanted to be sneaking out a flask and drinking 2 or 3 or 4 other places. And I said, look, everybody knows it about you. It's not, the point is not to do more of it, but not to do it. That it's very interesting to see somebody that's described as drinking secretly all the time.
And you never
see it, and you never see the results, except in a way you do. Acting drunk is a very tricky thing, and the best thing of all is to ignore it.
Right.
And pretty much they did that. And then...
Well, Sandy has to go the furthest because she's obviously not, within the context of the story, not a drinker, and not a good drinker.
Right. But the thing about Sandy was that she was brilliant at extreme states of all kinds.
Right.
And that she always found some strange new way of coming at it that nobody had ever done before. Later it harmed her sometimes because she was so eccentric. But nothing she did was ever conventional, and for Honey it was perfect.
It's kind of... Was there any... When you thought about casting Honey, was it... She has to be sort of annoying. I mean, if you don't go there, then you've taken like 2 teeth out of the,
That's
the
right.
piece, because you're supposed to have this very complicated reaction to her. That on the one hand you find her sort of annoying, and on the other hand, when she's toyed with and people are cruel to her, you feel bad.
Yes.
But partially because you feel in collusion to some extent.
Yeah,
Did you think about that? I mean, if you cast a young girl who looks like Elizabeth Taylor, it doesn't work.
No. I think the main thing about Honey, it's what they did on the stage, and certainly what Sandy did, is you have to get a comedienne for Honey. Because anybody who's really funny can be annoying and still not drive you crazy. Melinda Dillon, who did it on the stage and who was right out of our group in Chicago, the Second City, that was what she did. She was hilarious and adorable and annoying.
Right.
In turns, whatever you wanted. You know her, I mean, because she played big parts for Spielberg.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I love her.
She's wonderful. And Sandy, I mean, the glory of Sandy was that whatever she was playing, she was funny at least part of the time. And in every way, an unusual person. So that it's that tricky thing. You know, I used to, because of Elaine May largely, I used to define really great acting as somebody being inside a person and outside at the same time. That they could manage to make the case for the person and exist as the person, but also just discreetly point out some of the drawbacks and the flaws of the person from outside. It's splitting it down the middle. It's that knife edge between parodying somebody and
Right.
between showing somebody and being somebody.
Right.
And the great ones can do exactly that. Like Maggie Smith, that's what you're looking at. Sandy certainly did it, and I think you needed.
So she was, when you talk, I feel bad during Elizabeth's big monologue
It's
talking
so
about
true.
another actor.
Yeah,
But,
quite true.
but it's relevant to all the actors. What they're again, this issue of sort of self-consciousness and an awareness of what you're doing, an awareness of the effect of what you're doing. When you're talking about somebody like Sandy, was she? Did she understand everything that she was doing? Because she's very, she's very skilled, and there's actually a lot going on there physically. She does a lot with her voice. Did she really understand, every piece of what she was doing, or was she just more intuitive and just would say, I'm gonna go somewhere?
Well, I think she did both at once. That is to say, she could handle it all technically very easily, but she also. There are other actors like that. Chris Walken is one. They go with the impulse of the moment because it's the joke I make about it is that it's reverence for life. That anything that's alive, they'll go with, rather than that what's been planned. And of course, movies love that, and you can modulate it by as you know, by the choices when you're cutting it. But she was technically very skilled, as you say, and also could summon up a stumble into emotion when it happened.
Why, baby, don't you like it?
You can't do this.
Who says?
I say.
Tell us why, baby.
No.
Is this game over?
Yes, it's over.
I would assume you feel there's a benefit, as we're watching the sort of climax of the movie, in a sense, and the emotions are getting the notes are getting sort of deeper and longer. All of everything that's been set up now is starting to pay off. That shooting sort of in as much sequence as possible becomes a really important element here.
Very important.
Even with all the rehearsal, you still, I don't know. There's a sense when you know you're committing it to film, and it's gonna be stuck like this, and you're doing the big emotional scenes. I know there's just that pressure you all feel of, are we gonna get it, or we gotta get it?
But they really worked their way to this. That's definitely true. That we were at it so long, and they spent so many days. Elizabeth had to spit at him for a whole couple of days, and the things they had to do to each other really disorganized them also. And then, of course, there's also I think in the end, the thing that I understand best about acting from the couple of times I've tried it is it's everything what you get to do. When it's something like this, you think, oh, yes, just thank you for giving me such amazing things to say. That there's an actual joy in that. And for an actor to be given such things, such lines, such images, and that you owe it to them to fill them, people feel that. I think we were all happy doing this because of that, because Albee had given everybody such a gift.
What did Albee think of the film?
Well, he I was very nervous, obviously because I cared a lot, and he called afterwards, and he said he was very happy, and I think he was. And he complained about the score, which was both a good and a bad sign. It was good because at least he was complaining about something, so that maybe he wasn't being polite about the rest of it. And of course, if you're a writer like him, you don't want any score. You want to hear the rhythms of the words.
Right.
God knows they're enough. But I think that then and till now, he's always been, I think he liked it.
Mm-hmm.
We got a telegram. There was a car accident, and he's dead. Poof! Just like that. Now, how do you like it?
No!
All right, go now. Should be all right.
Now, for instance, the scene like the one we're watching right now, a breakdown scene. What, in this case, how did she work up to that?
Well, this was the place where the stuff that came before, when we were working on it, she would start to weep earlier and sort of fall apart, and I'd say, no, it has to keep going till there, and then. And then when we sort of pushed it into the shape it needed to be, she took a lot of strength from that. It was right, and she did it.
Well, it makes me, when you were talking about having great material and a performer who can, how the material can help fill you up, it makes me think that maybe we're handing out awards for the wrong stuff. That we should be analyzing the worst texts and seeing what performers do with who are getting no help, how they fare.
That's always very interesting. But
I don't think anybody's going to do it.
no, I don't think so either.
No, but I think you're right. I mean, when you've got material on this level, it's just it does a lot. It does a lot.
There's another thing too, I think, which is that I think of this in the theater more than movies now, where somebody expects a lot from us, like the new Stoppard play about Czechoslovakia. You're thinking, oh God, I don't know enough about the history, and you're listening, and you're investing in the first act, and then he harvests it in the second act, that he's made you work. And a movie in which there's an imaginary child and somebody gets this upset about saying he's dead, and a movie that forces you to consider metaphor and what could it possibly mean. And God knows, one of the things that you learn about metaphors is that you're not supposed to have to describe exactly what it means. That's the point. Leave it alone. And the thing that I'm always saying when we're working on movies is that I say, which is a good movie is about something and also about something else. That this text is such an extreme example of that I still think it means something to an audience to find a new part of themselves.
I mentioned him, all right, but you didn't have to push it over the edge. You didn't have to kill him.
Requiescat in pace.
Amen.
It's sort of amazing to me when I watch this that it's so extreme.
That's it.
And there are, most of us in this situation, let's say the initial violation was that she mentioned the unmentionable. So many of us, or most of us, our reaction to that would be, after the guests have gone home, to say, I really wish you hadn't.
Right.
As opposed to seeing an opportunity to as he to exercise some demons in a semi-public arena. That's not what most of us would do, and yet it's totally compelling to watch.
Well, it is, and within it are so many recognizable things. A man who has just stopped listening to his wife, bitching about how ineffectual he is, and castrating him in every possible way all the time, who says in a way, okay, enough. You haven't known it and you haven't admitted it, but I've been the boss all the time. And let me just remind you. And she's forever reminded. Their lives are different now.
Right.
And that's something we can all identify with, not necessarily the worm turning, but just things. Well, the whole stretch of a play or a movie has to be the most important moments, time in the characters' lives. And there has to be a change, and this is the big change. He's back in charge, or in charge for the first time.
Do you think it is the first time?
Well, I think that it's...
Is that, I mean, did you operate from that position in thinking about it?
Overtly the first time. It's the thing of, it happens in life. One of you holds all the cards. Well, when one of you really holds all the cards, it's hopeless. But when one of you has a very good hand, it's not necessarily clear for a long time how crucial the other one is. And it can be turned upside down. That does happen. And I think then it is forever.
Here's a situation, for instance. Is this something you would have talked to Sam about, or Haskell? You made a very conscious decision earlier on. We were in a lot of close-ups. Then we backed out at a very specific moment into a four-shot, leading into them leaving the house. You've got a match cut there on the light cue to a shot that's going to turn into the last shot.
Right.
Is this how would that sort of the laying out of those shots? How would that have happened in your mind? And then who would you be working with to say, well, let's get out of the close-ups now. I want to slow it down. I want to back out.
Well, I knew for a long time that I wanted to make the gear shift with turning out the light. You know, it's the visual equivalent of let's climb them well-worn stairs.
And you felt once that act happened, you wanted to sustain and be into the last shot of the movie?
Yes, yeah. I knew that. I was already in love from other people's work, with not cutting.
Right.
And, I mean, what I called this to myself was an old joke that a friend of mine in college made, all passion spent in craft ebbing. And that's what my little nickname for it was, that this is after every conceivable kind of orgasm.
Right.
And the light was always going to be that transition. And Richard, of course, this is one of the best things he did in the whole movie. He knew exactly what was wanted there. And I have to say, so did Haskell and Sam and I later, and Sam, that it's written at last. The lines are so short, and 2-word lines, 3 words, 1 word, that in a way it almost tells you what to do.
And then there's the really terrific, the very end when you go in and there's a sort of light effect for the sun, which is terrific. Was that, again, something that as the shot developed, did Haskell, oh, you know what we can do? We can do, we can have the sun come up, or was that?
I think it was always part of the design in my mind, because it starts with the moon and ends with the sun.
Right.
And that's I make these little patterns for myself. I don't care if anybody else ever notices them. Do you do that too?
Oh, absolutely. And you said that shot at the beginning of the movie, the moon shot, was from some vampire...
Osteen found it in some obscure vampire picture and just slammed it in. We tried shooting the moon a couple of times, and it was awful.
Right, as it always is.
Yes, and Sam just said, why don't we pick some from the
That's
Masters?
Hilarious.
Now, in this shot, this whole thing, the party has been happening behind this.
Right.
I never conceived of a party at this time. This was the rap party.
Yeah, right.
But I had a whole long time where I wanted, I can't even remember, I thought that there was something, I have to look at the text. I feel as though, albeit at one point, invokes Walpurgisnacht and actually says it in a stage direction.
Mm-hmm.
But I have to look up to see whether that's true. But in my mind, originally, when they went out, when they took their drive in the car and everything, that somehow, for some reason, I wanted to explore Walpurgisnacht on campus, as it were.
Right.
And then this was way before we started shooting. And as we got closer to shooting, I thought, no, that's all crap. You know, that it has to be the 4 of them, and that's all there is to it.
That's the universe.
Yeah.
Right. I think that was a good call. Well, Mike, I want to thank you. We've done this 2 times now for two films, so we've only got, 20 to go?
Yeah, I'm glad we made a good start.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.